So, this all started when Brian, my boyfriend, finally got tired of my endless hesitation. His words, not mine. We had been tossing around the idea of hosting a swing party for months. Maybe even years. It was always just an idea, something we'd bring up jokingly after a few drinks, then conveniently forget about the next day. The thought of actually going through with it was both thrilling and terrifying. But then last Friday, Brian looked me dead in the eyes while we were eating takeout and said, "Let's stop talking about it. Let's do it tomorrow." Just like that. He wasn't smiling. No teasing tone. Just leaning back in his chair like he had suggested we try a new restaurant instead of throwing a party that would completely redefine our relationship. I blinked, my fork frozen halfway to my mouth. "Tomorrow. You want to throw a swing party tomorrow?" He shrugged, completely unfazed. "Why not? We know enough people. You've been saying you're curious. Plus I'm tired of putting it off. It's like ripping off a Band-Aid. Except instead of a Band-Aid, it's inviting half the city into our living room for something we've never done before." Here's the thing, I couldn't argue with him. We had been putting it off. Always some excuse. The house wasn't ready. The guest list wasn't right. We were too busy. If we kept waiting for the perfect moment, it would never happen. So, against my better judgment, I found myself nodding. "Fine. Let's do it. But if this turns into a disaster, I'm blaming you." And just like that, we were committed. We texted a few close friends, people we knew from the community, the kind who might actually show up. I wasn't expecting much. Maybe a handful would be interested, and even fewer would actually come. Brian, ever the optimist, was convinced we'd get a full house. The next day was a blur of cleaning and low-key panicking. We cleaned like royalty was visiting, stocked up on drinks, and put together a playlist that was the perfect mix of sensual but not too on the nose. By the time 8 p.m. rolled around, I was already half a glass of wine deep, trying to calm my nerves. Then the doorbell rang. The first couple to arrive was exactly who I expected. James and Clara, a married pair in their 30s who had been in the scene for a while. They greeted us like it was just another casual gathering, but the glint in their eyes told a different story. "You ready for this?" Clara asked, smirking as she handed me a bottle of wine. "Ready as I'll ever be," I replied, hoping my voice didn't shake. More people trickled in, one or two at a time. The house filled with laughter and easy conversation, and surprisingly it all felt normal. People were dressed well. Nothing too wild. Just sleek outfits that hinted at possibilities without being too obvious. For the first time all day I started to relax. Maybe this wouldn't be so bad after all. And then, something unexpected happened. The night had already taken a strange turn. Just when I thought the party would settle into a groove, I saw them. 2 men in their 60s, probably older, walking through the door with a casualness that immediately stood out. I glanced at Brian, hoping he hadn't invited them. No way would we have invited anyone that age to something like this. Or would we? I felt my stomach drop. My mind was already racing through 100 possibilities. What if they were just here to cause trouble? What if this was the kind of party that attracted the oddball crowd? Brian squeezed my hand, noticing my discomfort. "Relax. They're just here to have fun," he whispered. "But Brian, they're—" "Well, not our usual crowd," I muttered, eyes flicking back to the older men, who had already struck up a conversation with a couple by the snack table. Brian shrugged again, that familiar, calm demeanor never wavering. "Does it matter? People are here for the same reason, no matter who they are. Just enjoy the night." I looked back at the 2 men who seemed comfortable, like they had done this before. That thought did little to calm my nerves. Instead, it fueled my uncertainty. The party was starting to feel more like a social experiment, a realm where anything could happen. "Maybe we should just make the best of it," I said, sighing, trying to shake off my discomfort. A little more wine wouldn't hurt, right? By 9:30, the living room had started to fill with a different kind of energy. Laughter mixed with soft jazz music, and the tension in the air seemed to thicken. People were more relaxed, the conversation starting to drift from casual to something more suggestive. And with every glance I stole toward the 2 men, I noticed that they didn't seem out of place at all. James, always the smooth talker, leaned in close to me and whispered, "It's a lot to take in at first, but just go with the flow. That's how it all works." I didn't reply right away. Instead, I nodded slowly, uncertain if I wanted to get deeper into this unfamiliar world. But there was something undeniably exhilarating about it. As the night continued, I watched as people formed into small groups, engaging in quiet conversations that seemed to carry some weight, like there was more to the words than I could understand. James and Clara were engaged in an animated conversation with a couple I didn't recognize, their laughter louder than the others, but it felt like part of the rhythm. Then it happened. Someone approached me, a man with dark, sharp eyes. His smile was confident but not overbearing. His gaze lingered on me a little too long, and the sudden heat in my cheeks told me everything I needed to know. He wasn't here for the casual banter. I could feel the weight of his presence next to me, and I didn't know whether to welcome it or retreat from it. He extended a hand with a quiet, "I'm Evan." His voice low but warm, drawing me in. "Emma," I replied, my voice sounding a little foreign to my ears. There was something magnetic about Evan. He wasn't pushy, but he had a way of looking at me that made me feel like he could see right through me. I found myself drawn to him, but at the same time I wanted to pull back. My heart was racing, my hands suddenly clammy, and I realized I was staring at him. It was unsettling. "So, this your first time?" he asked casually, leaning against the wall. He didn't seem in a rush, taking his time as if waiting for me to open up. I hesitated. How could I explain my hesitations without sounding like a complete prude? "Yeah," I said, nodding, unsure how to finish the sentence. "It's definitely new." Evan's grin deepened. I figured. "But don't worry, everyone's here for the same thing. No pressure." He glanced over at the older men, who were now casually chatting with someone by the door. "It's about having fun, about exploring and finding out what you like." He paused, then added with a playful gleam in his eyes, "But it's all about the vibe. Just let yourself feel it." The words hung in the air, and I couldn't shake the sense that he was trying to give me a nudge, urging me toward something I wasn't sure I was ready for. I knew what kind of night this was supposed to be, but the closer I got to it, the less I felt in control of my decisions. The more Evan's words echoed in my mind. Before I could answer, a soft voice interrupted. "Care for a drink?" It was Clara, with a bottle of wine in hand, the glint of mischief in her smile as she offered me a glass. I didn't want to seem rude, so I took it, my fingers brushing against hers in the exchange. The warmth of the glass was a comforting distraction, but my mind was still reeling. "Everything okay?" she asked, her eyes briefly meeting Evan's, then back to me. "Yeah," I replied quickly, taking a sip of wine. "Just getting used to all of this." Clara gave me a knowing smile, one that seemed to suggest she had been in my shoes before, maybe even just the night before. "Take your time. No one's in a hurry here." The air felt thick again, but this time I was ready to let it envelop me. Maybe I could enjoy myself. Maybe it wasn't all as intimidating as it seemed. But then, something strange happened. I noticed one of the older men, the one with graying hair and a look that almost screamed veteran, was making his way toward me. I could tell he was watching me, his eyes sharp, scanning me as he approached. The instinct to move back crept up again, but I didn't want to be rude. I could feel my pulse quicken as the older man approached. His presence seemed to dominate the room, despite the casualness of his movements. He was tall, with graying hair and a slow, measured gait that made him seem more experienced than anyone else in the room. I couldn't quite place it, but there was something about him that made my instincts scream. My gaze flicked to Brian, who was talking to someone across the room, completely unaware of the shift in energy. I took another sip of my wine, trying to steady my nerves, but my hands were still shaking. "You look like you're deep in thought," the older man said. His voice smooth and surprisingly gentle, considering the way his eyes studied me. I blinked, caught off guard. "Oh, just trying to take it all in." He smiled, a knowing, almost fatherly smile. It's a lot at first. But you'll get used to it. I nodded, unsure if I wanted to be used to it. The tension in my chest was rising. Was I in over my head? Mind if I join you? He asked, gesturing to the space beside me. I hesitated, then smiled politely. Of course. He sat down slowly, his body language unhurried, and for a moment, there was only the distant sound of laughter and music. I felt oddly at ease next to him, though a part of me was still trying to figure out what he wanted. Why was he so interested in me? The conversation drifted between small talk and deeper, more personal topics. I learned that his name was Richard, that he had been part of the scene for years, and that he had seen it all. Something in the way he spoke made me feel like he wasn't just telling stories. He was sharing wisdom, lessons learned through experience. I laughed nervously, unsure of what to say. So, you've been to a lot of these parties? Richard nodded, his gaze never leaving mine. More than I care to count, he replied. His tone light but with a subtle edge that made my curiosity grow. But every party is different. It's not just about the act. It's about the connections you make. Energy. The people. His words hung in the air, and I found myself thinking about them more than I should have. I glanced around the room, noticing the way people were interacting. Some were already paired off, chatting intimately, while others lingered near the snacks and drinks, laughing and joking. And then, without warning, Richard leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a whisper. You don't have to do anything you're not ready for, you know. I stiffened, surprised by the sudden intimacy of his words. I wasn't planning on it, I stammered. Richard chuckled softly, his eyes twinkling. It's all about the journey, not the destination. I didn't know how to respond. What was he implying? Was he trying to get me to join in? Was he testing the waters, seeing how far he could push? Before I could answer, the room seemed to shift again, as if the air had thickened. I could feel the subtle tension rise. People were becoming more comfortable with each other, stepping closer, touching more freely, as if the party was entering a new phase. I looked back at Brian, but he was still engrossed in his conversation. I realized with a pang that I was alone in this. Alone with my thoughts, with this strange, growing desire to push my limits. Richard's hand gently brushed against mine, just a fleeting touch, but it sent a shock through my system. I glanced at him, unsure of how to interpret it. His smile was soft, reassuring. It's okay to let go. No one's judging you here. For a moment I thought about it. Letting go. Letting myself relax, to fully embrace this wild new experience. But then doubt crept in. Was I just going along with the crowd? Was I losing sight of who I was in the process? I took a deep breath and decided, for once, to just breathe. To let the moment take me wherever it would. I stood up, feeling a sudden rush of energy. I needed to move, to get away from the intensity of Richard's gaze. I told myself it was just the wine, just the environment. I walked to the center of the room, where a small group had gathered. Clara waved me over, her eyes sparkling with excitement. Come on, join us, she said, motioning toward a couple of people who were playfully chatting. I hesitated, but then I found myself crossing the room, as if drawn by an invisible thread. The moment felt surreal, like I was stepping into a new version of myself that I hadn't yet fully understood. As I joined the group, I felt the weight of all the eyes on me. The feeling was both exhilarating and terrifying. People were staring, not in a judgmental way, but in a way that made me aware of how exposed I felt. But then someone smiled. A small, friendly gesture, and the tension began to melt away. I relaxed, letting the moment happen. The music, the conversation, the glances. It was all part of the experience. But in the back of my mind, a question lingered. Was this really what I wanted? Or was I just getting caught up in the excitement, in the novelty of it all? I didn't have time to answer that question just yet. The night was only beginning, and already, things were starting to take unexpected turns. By now, the evening had shifted into something unrecognizable. What had started as a casual gathering, albeit with some hidden tension, was now a scene of heightened emotions and mixed signals. I wasn't sure whether I was more curious or conflicted, but there was no denying that the atmosphere had changed. People were no longer standing off in their little groups. They were closer, more intimate, and the air buzzed with anticipation. The lines between the platonic and the sensual were becoming blurred, and I found myself in the midst of it all. Clara had pulled me aside, offering a few more glasses of wine. "You're doing great," she said, giving me an encouraging smile. It was almost as if she could sense my uncertainty. "Just remember, no one here is judging you. You can go as far as you want, or stay as far back as you need." I nodded, the words resonating, but there was still something holding me back. Despite the way my body responded to the energy in the room, something in the pit of my stomach told me I wasn't ready. It wasn't about what I thought I should do. It was about what felt right for me. Brian was still talking to James in the corner, oblivious to the strange current flowing through the room. He didn't seem concerned, and his calm demeanor only made me feel more out of place. I didn't want to be the one holding everything back, but I wasn't sure I could let go. Not completely. As I took another step back, I noticed Richard again. He was speaking with some of the other guests, laughing, but his eyes never strayed far from me. It felt like a pull I couldn't ignore. He was experienced, he knew this world, this rhythm, and I was standing on the edge, watching. His gaze lingered a moment longer, and then, as if sensing the internal struggle I was facing, he excused himself from the group and made his way over to me. He didn't say anything immediately, just stood by my side for a moment, letting the silence stretch between us. "You don't have to jump in if you're not ready," Richard said, his voice low, his breath warm against my ear. "But don't let fear be the reason you don't." I looked up at him, my heart racing. "I'm just not sure if this is for me," I admitted, the words sounding strange even as I said them. Richard smiled softly, his eyes kind. "And there's no rush. But you should never let doubt hold you back from an experience you want to have. It's all about what feels right." For the first time that night, I felt the weight of his words. I'd been so caught up in the idea of what should happen, trying to live up to some imagined expectation of myself, that I hadn't even stopped to think about what I really wanted. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the flutter in my chest. This wasn't just about anyone else. It was about me and what I was ready for. If I was going to experience this world, I had to be in control of my choices, not just swept away by the current. The group around us had started to shift, and I noticed a few couples disappearing into different rooms, the energy in the house rising with each passing minute. The music played on, slower now, seductive in its rhythm, and I found myself swept up in it. I turned back to Richard, who was watching me with that same patient smile. "Do you want to take a walk?" I asked, surprising even myself with the sudden boldness. He raised an eyebrow, then nodded. "Sure." We stepped out onto the balcony, where the cool night air brushed against my skin. It was quieter here, away from the thrum of the party, and I felt like I could finally think. The city lights stretched before us, distant and comforting. "Sometimes," Richard said after a moment, "it's the quiet moments that tell you the most." I looked at him, unsure of what he meant, but somehow understanding. And then, without warning, the door behind us opened. It was Clara, with a mischievous grin on her face. "You two look like you're deep in conversation," she teased. "Ready to come back in? Things are heating up." I felt my heart skip a beat. A part of me wanted to say yes, to go back into the fray and embrace whatever this night might offer. But another part of me wanted to hold on to the peace I'd found in this quiet corner. Before I could respond, Richard placed a hand gently on my shoulder. "No pressure," he said, his voice calm. "We can take this as slow as you need. Or fast. The choice is yours." The words lingered in the air as Clara disappeared back inside. I glanced back at Richard, who seemed to be waiting for me to make up my mind. The whole night had been about choices, about stepping into a world I didn't fully understand, but for the first time, I felt like I was in control. The energy in the house was pulling me back in, but I knew what I needed to do. Whatever happened next, it would be my decision. I smiled at Richard. Let's go back inside.